A full-on battle between the Sudanese army and their opponents, the Rapid Support Forces. This conflict is slowly becoming a full-blown civil war. But why is Sudan at war, again, and what does this really mean for Africa? I'm going to try and explain this entire conflict in 5 minutes. Up until 1956, Sudan was jointly governed by the Egyptians and British. The Egyptians and their Muslim counterparts governed the north, and the British in the south, where the Christian missionaries spread their gospel. Now, essentially, the religious difference becomes greatly important when the country was granted independence. In this new state, political power was mainly held by the Muslim northern elites, where the southern Christian elites felt like they were kind of being neglected. Then they fought. Essentially, these battles resulted in what we now call the First and Second Sudanese Civil Wars. We'll concentrate on the latter one for now. The central government in a peace agreement allowed South Sudan to hold a referendum for independence, and in 2011, South Sudan was born as a state. But why is this important? How did it impact the current conflict? Well, Sudan was a huge oil exporter, and essentially this oil money kept their economy afloat. 75% of the oil production came from South Sudan, and essentially losing South Sudan to their own independence, they lost their most valuable resource. Oh, did I forget to mention that the US sanctioned Sudan from 2007 to 2017, which further destroyed their economy? Now, the Sudanese pound essentially collapsed and the people were pissed. We'll come back to this later. For now, let's concentrate on the main characters of this conflict. Since the 80s, Sudan was ruled by a dictator, Al-Bashir. He has been in power for 30 years and has been accused of mass killings and ethnic cleansings. But to facilitate these actions, he created his own personal army, a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, led by his right-hand man, Hemedti. They are known locally as the Janjaweed, translated to the Devils on Horseback. The RSF was one of the main parties responsible for the genocide in Darfur in 2013. Now fast forward to 2019, and remember when I said that the Sudanese economy collapsed and the people were pissed? They were angry at the government for failing to do anything about the collapse of the economy, and they were also super angry that the government was consistently killing a lot of people. This massive protest occurred in 2019, and al-Bashir had to step down. The people got what they want, right? Well, not exactly. Now with al-Bashir gone, it left a huge power vacuum and the military took over. The people were just as angry, so the military announced that they would essentially transition to a full democracy. But for now, we will have a military council foreseeing the country's future. The leader of this council and the representative of the Sudanese army was General Al-burhan, and the deputy of the council was Hemedti, who leads the RSF. These two used to be pretty good friends. They were allies. I mean, they worked together to take down their boss, Al-Bashir. But there was an issue. They couldn't decide on who should have what power. During this transition period, Hemedti and the RSF managed to establish control of the country's resources, mainly the gold trade. Now with the RSF getting very powerful, the central government wanted to reintegrate them within the army. At this point, the RSF and the Sudanese army are similar in size, with around 100,000 troops each. Al-burhan suggested a 2-year integration period, whereas Hemedti wanted 10 years before full reintegration. Of course, they couldn't agree on a timeline, and war began. Both sides accused each other of starting the war first, attacking each other's bases in Khartoum, the nation's capital. The fighting has been brutal and concentrated within the streets of the city, door-to-door fighting terrorizing civilians. And with this conflict, we can see African countries starting to take sides. Egypt has been aiding Sudan as they have been longtime allies, whereas reports have said that Libyan militia groups have been aiding RSF troops. It means the continuing destabilization of the Horn of Africa. And essentially, this is how the Sudanese conflict came to be. How are we doing for time? We're doing okay? Okay, what does this really mean for Africa? Ethiopia can't help because they're still recovering from the Tigray War. South Sudan is going through a huge tribal war, and Eritrea and Somalia are essentially failed states. The UN has called for a ceasefire, but no one is listening to them. Why? Because the international community hasn't placed bets on either side. Western powers still don't know who will win, so they don't really want to enter the fray yet. The world is watching this conflict to see who will have an edge, and the winning side will probably be given international support. But in reality, the real people suffering are the people of Sudan. It's reported that hundreds of thousands of refugees have poured into Chad and Egypt. No one knows who will win this conflict, or if this conflict is a beginning of another 20-year-long civil war.